Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 44 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs, presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
Myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisis.ie.
Mark, good to see you as always. And you will recall last week we had an interview with Barry Creed, who's a partner in the firm of McDermott, Creed and Martin. And he had placed a post on LinkedIn, which I saw and I really liked. And I know you saw it then and you were really interested as well. He was identifying issues for solicitors' firms. It wasn't all negative. It was, all kind of grown-up kind of reflections.
In fact, in many ways, it was a very positive view.
It was very positive.
Yeah,
Great interview with him. I enjoyed that. Well, today we are moving into different territory as we're going to talk to a solicitor who gave up running her own firm to become a barrister. And then she gave that up. And now, much more interestingly, she has become a novelist, writing crime fiction. Andrea Carter's first novel, published in 2015, Death at Whitewater Church, introduced her literary hero, solicitor Benedicta O'Keeffe, who has been the subject of a number of books. Mark, and I think Andrea is a mate of yours.
Absolutely. We were in college together, yeah.
I can't wait for this interview.
I've really enjoyed reading her books.
I haven't read her books, and that's why I'm just so curious to find out about this. Now, really looking forward to it. But first, we're going to take our visit down to the Decisis website, which you are in charge of, Mark, as all our loyal listeners will know. And in a departure of source today, we're just going to focus on one specific case, which we think is worth being just the case to think about today.
I think this is an interesting one.
It's a curious one, okay? This is the decision of Tomas Heneghan, or Heneghan, I presume it is.
Heneghan, I think.
Heneghan, Minister for Housing. It's the lead decision is coming from the Chief Justice, Donal O'Donnell. And this is one where the Supreme Court had to consider legislation, whether it was constitutional or not, and in relation to the selection or the election of university Seanad seats to graduates of the NUI or Dublin University, which is obviously Trinity College. The system where there's a restriction on the entitlement to vote, and certain third-level education institutions are not entitled to participate in this, and all of that sort of stuff. So take it away, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the peculiar thing is it's actually the supplemental decision I wanted to look at this week, because they'd already made the determination that the selection of university senators was unconstitutional. But of course, once you make that declaration, you then need to decide, well, what is the effect of that? And so the question they had to answer, I mean, obviously, in extreme circumstances that you might say, well, the existing university senators just automatically lose their seats. That obviously didn't happen. So the question was...
Could the whole Oireachtas fall as a result of this if it's unconstitutional?
But, well, the real issue was what would have happened if there was an election called the day after this decision? Because there are 6 seats there for university graduates, and would their election be unconstitutional? And so the Chief Justice really had to discuss, well, what is the power of the Supreme Court? Do they have the power effectively to say, right, this is unconstitutional, but not yet? And
sounds like St. Augustine.
The old question is, does the Supreme Court have the right to legislate? Are they simply interpreting the laws, or do they have a role in making law? And so what he said in this case was, well, if we declare this unconstitutional today, the system isn't set up to allow for a constitutional election of university university senate
very
seats.
Good point. Very interesting point.
And I mean, I was curious about this because he looked back over a number of different cases. But the one that it reminded me of, but that they didn't actually look at, was the case of Blake and the Attorney General, which, if you remember, is where they found that the old rent control was unconstitutional. And again, they could well have found, as soon as it was unconstitutional, suddenly that there would have been a free-for-all for landlords where they would suddenly be able to put rent up, and there would have been tens of thousands of people made homeless. But in that case, they effectively allowed for legislation to be made, and there was another challenge to that legislation. But there was a bit of a fudge. Whereas in this case,
but there could only be a very brief interregnum between, this being shot down as unconstitutional, and then a replacement mechanism which would be, compliant with the Constitution being put in place.
Well, the curious thing here was that Tomas Heneghan, who brought the case, said there should just be a 1-year stay. Both sides agreed that there should be a stay on the Declaration of Constitutionality. Tomas Heneghan said there should be a 1-year stay. The Attorney General argued that they would need much more time in order to prepare basically a whole new electorate of university graduates, however they're going to do it. And the Supreme Court unanimously held was that 1 year was probably a bit short, but the length of time the AG was looking for was a bit long. So they basically said that the declaration of unconstitutionality will kick in on the 31st of May 2025.
Okay, so what happens? There's a vote in the Dáil and the government loses its majority, collapses. They have to go to the country. There has to be an election within 4 weeks. Okay, yeah. There has to be a Seanad election within maybe 6 weeks of that. I'm not sure what the actual time
period is. I think it's 3 months.
3 months. Okay, so there is a finite period.
Yeah.
So is the Supreme Court saying that, okay, we're not striking this down for a year, but they know it is unconstitutional and they've made a finding that it's unconstitutional. So are they going to give the green light to an election for seats that are contrary to the Constitution? I think that's kind of worrying, really.
I think there's a bit of realpolitik here that they've effectively said you simply can't have a vacuum whereby the existing elections is unconstitutional, but nothing new has come into place. So there's no huge injustice in the existing system, I think it's fair to say. Senators of themselves...
Augustinian, isn't it?
It is Augustinian.
Make me pure, but not yet.
What I think is curious here is that because I think the last election was in early 2020, this declaration doesn't kick in until the 31st of May 2025. So the next election will be the last one under which the 6 Senate seats are limited to the graduates of the NUI and Dublin University.
Mark, you better get your election papers in quick. I believe the reason you wanted to focus on this decision so much is because you harbour a little ambition there, do you?
I'm making no announcement at this time. But how about yourself, Peter? I think you're a graduate of the National University
of Ireland. Well, we have a much bigger electorate than you guys in Trinity. That's
anyway,
okay.
But anyway, so I'm trusting you to write the Fifth Court manifesto.
I think you've heard it now, folks. Vote number 1, Tottenham.
No, Leonard, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. All right, back shortly with our interview with Andrea Carter, novelist, former barrister, former solicitor, and now very successful crime novelist.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So it is a particular pleasure to welcome to the studio Andrea Carter, who is a well-known crime novelist, but previously practiced both as a solicitor and barrister. She, having graduated from Trinity, qualified in her hometown of Portlaoise, and then went all the way up to Carndonagh, the very northernmost town in the country, practiced in another practice, then started Carter & Co. Solicitors for a number of years, then decided to come off the role of solicitors and become a barrister, practiced in the criminal courts for a number of years, and then in 2015 published Death at Whitewater Church. And that has started a whole series of novels set in the fictitious town of Glendara on the Inishowen Peninsula, where the heroine is a solicitor by the name of Benedicta O'Keeffe. Andy, is there any similarity between Benedicta O'Keeffe and your good self?
Well, there might be, I suppose. My first review said that I didn't have to move too far for my inspiration. My main character, my protagonist, my amateur sleuth, Benedicta O'Keeffe, or Ben O'Keeffe, runs the most northerly solicitor's practice in the country. And coincidentally, I ran the most northerly solicitor's practice in the country. Somebody who isn't too far away from me pointed out that it would be last legal advice before Iceland and that I should put it on my notepaper. So yes, certainly when I started writing, I was still practicing in Inishowen. I was still practicing as a solicitor, and I started writing sort of as a way to keep me away from the wine bottle and to sort of stop me worrying about work that I was doing during the day. At night, I would write. And I would write these scenes that were sort of very close to what I was doing during the day, but with a character who could do things that I wouldn't have been able to get away with and say things to clients that I wouldn't have been able to get away with. So it was sort of cathartic. And those scenes have never seen the light of day because they were just too close to what I was doing at the time.
So in all your years of legal practice, you harboured literary ambitions?
I didn't. I actually never thought that I would be published. And I certainly never thought that the scenes that I was writing while I was still practicing would ever be published. And they haven't been. As I say, they were just too close to what I was doing during the day. But I continued doing it as a hobby, and it took me 10 years to write my first novel because I was practicing both as a solicitor and then later as a barrister. When I sold my practice in Inishowen and I moved to the bar, I had more spare time, and I had longer holidays, and I started to take my writing, my hobby, more seriously, and I started to do some courses, and I started to enter some writing competitions, and I had a small degree of success, and it made me think, oh, maybe I might be able to have a short story published. But eventually, what I had started writing in Inishowen 10 years beforehand eventually turned into a crime novel. I'd finished it.
Now, can I come back to the crime in a minute? But what I'd like to ask, you obviously have the benefit of a bit of distance from legal practice.
Yes.
And having been both a solicitor and a barrister, can you sum up for our listeners, first of all, I suppose, if you had to go back to one, if the writing stopped working, do you miss one more than the other, or did one of them have advantages over the other, or are you glad really at this stage to be out of the legal world?
I mean, I practiced law for a couple of decades, really, and so I feel that I have given enough time probably to my legal practice, both as a solicitor and as a barrister. Having said that, I love writing, and I love the sort of solitary element of writing. Having said that, when I drive through a town and the circuit court is sitting and there's a crowd of gowns on the steps, and I can see the sort of adrenaline pumping, I can kind of feel it when I'm driving past. I feel a pang and I think, oh yeah, I kind of miss it. I do miss it sometimes. But
you don't get the same thrill from literary festivals? I
like literary festivals, yeah, I do. I have just come back from London, where I did a festival called Capital Crime in a big hotel which was beside St. Paul's, and it was great fun. You know, right. Crime writers are great crack. They really are.
Can I go back a little bit, Andy? Because yourself and Mark are old pals, so he knows the whole story. I don't, and it's lovely to meet you. It's really lovely to meet you, and I can't wait to read the book. To my shame, I haven't read your books beforehand, but I will after this show.
Shocking.
I can guarantee you. You started out, you're from Portlaoise. You're from right in the heart of Ireland, okay?
I am.
And how, in the name of God, did you end up in Carndonagh? The last solicitor before, he was saying Iceland. I was thinking of Rockall or somewhere, you know? So how did you end up there?
Well, I mean, I'm from Ballyfin, actually. I'm from an even smaller place than Portlaoise, a little village.
With the beautiful hotel, isn't it? And
that's right. It used to be a school, actually.
That's Patrician Brothers. That's right.
My dad used to teach in the school. And I grew up in the schoolhouse that's across from one of the lodges, which is an old Victorian schoolhouse. It was built for the children of the workmen of the estate. So it was a school, a primary school and residence attached. And my parents restored it when they came back from Zambia, room by room. And they still live there. So I grew up in Laois. I grew up in the most inland county in Ireland. So I grew up in the only county that doesn't touch a county which touches the sea. And then when I was looking for my first job as a fully qualified solicitor, I was called for an interview in Carndonagh. And I looked at the map and I thought, okay, that'll take about 4 hours maybe. And of course, it took much longer than that and the rest. So I moved from the most inland county in Ireland to a peninsula. So suddenly I was surrounded by sea on all three sides. So it was an adventure and
you just
slightly terrifying.
You put your tent down and said, this is where I'm going to be, and work away. And were you working on your own? Single firm?
No, not initially. Initially, my first job was with MD White and Company. So that was, I was working for Philip White, who was Michael White's brother. So that's their family practice.
Is that Michael White, the
Judge
High
Michael
Court
White,
judge?
that's right, yes. Good. So I worked there for about 2 years, and then I moved back to Dublin for about a year and returned and set up my own practice, which I ran for 7 or 8 years, I think.
And then you wanted to become a barrister.
I did. I was running my practice in Inishowen, and then I had always wanted to be a barrister. That was my plan on leaving Trinity, but I couldn't afford to do it. I couldn't afford not to earn. So I qualified as a solicitor and I started earning.
Okay, so you got yourself a job and then you were able to get into the profession.
Exactly. So I financed my career at the bar from the proceeds of the sale of my practice as a solicitor. Okay.
So Benedicta O'Keeffe, you're a heroine in this book. How many books in the series so far?
Number 6 just came out during the summer. Death Rights is the 6th one.
And you've knocked the legal practicing on the head. Gone. You're now a fully fledged writer.
Yes, I write full time. I left the bar in 2013. I took a year leave of absence to do a master's in creative writing. And I think I had an agent, a literary agent at that point, and I'd had some degree of success, and I was, hopeful that maybe I could make something out of my writing. Making a career out of it, I don't think it had occurred to me at that point that I could do that. But I wanted to take a year out of the bar and have some structure on my year writing. So I did a master's. And during that year, I got a book deal with a London publisher.
Wow. That's very quick, isn't it?
It is. Well, I mean, having said that, I spent 10 years writing the first book. But when I decided to pursue it seriously, then I was pretty lucky, really. Yeah. Now, I think I got about 75 rejections when I was looking for an agent. But once I had an agent...
It's all about resilience, isn't it?
Once I had an agent, I got a publisher quite quickly.
Okay. And the Fellowship of Crime Writers. I mean, there's quite a few of you guys out there at the moment.
Yeah, there are.
In Ireland, in particular.
Ireland, yeah. And we have... I did an interview for BBC Radio Ulster there a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this, about Northern Irish writers and Southern writers. And actually there's a really good cross-border community of writers. So there are a number of very successful Northern Irish crime writers, and there are a number of writers, there are a lot of Irish writers. But we mix really well together. We travelled to festivals together, and I was at a festival in Harrogate. There's a great crime fiction festival in Harrogate, which is held in the Swan Hotel, which is the hotel where Agatha Christie reappeared. I don't know if you know the story about Agatha Christie disappearing for 10 days and crashing her car. She turned up in the dining room of this hotel, the Swan Hotel in Harrogate. So they now run this.
That's a holy place for you
completely,
crime writers, absolutely.
It's Mecca, it's Mecca for crime writers. So they run this great crime fiction festival there. And I remember coming into the bar tent. I mean, if you're going to try and find the Irish writers, where do you find them? You find them in the bar tent. So I came into the bar tent and there was a long table of crime writers. All of the Irish crime writers had found each other. And there were writers from Belfast, and there were writers from Cork, and we were all mixed together. And it was great. It was a lovely atmosphere.
You described how you didn't want to go to the bar because of the financial insecurity when you left college. Is it any more financially secure being a crime writer than it is being a barrister? And I suppose the answer isn't as obvious as it might sound.
No, I knew you were going to ask me that. As soon as I mentioned the finance, I knew you'd ask me that. And actually, because I went to the bar late, I was in my late 30s by the time I got to the bar. And because I chose to do crime, it was quite a struggle to make a living. So in fact, I make just as good a living as a writer as I did as a barrister, even right at the end when I left.
And without going too much into the finances of it, I mean, when you're on your sixth book, as you said, do you find that there's a spike for each individual book, or is there a sort of continuing royalty from the old? For me, it's a kind of a rollover sort of effect, or a roll-on effect. At a certain point, I earned out my advance, which meant that then I start getting paid royalties. And I have a publisher in the States and a publisher in the UK. And so I get separate checks or separate payments, royalty payments twice a year from each. And also I do some workshops, I do a little bit of teaching. Ireland is really good for paying writers to do events. So you can, and also the Arts Council is great. I apply for Arts Council bursaries. Is there still a tax advantage for literary works?
There is, yeah. I mean, I sent my first book in to see if I could get the artist's exemption, and I got it. And then I sent my second book in, and they said, no, it's fine, you don't need to keep sending us books in, we'll post it back to you. And I said, oh no, just, send it around the office and, read it.
So Andy, if I can come back in there again. So I'm really looking forward to this next part of the conversation. As I said, sadly, I don't know your books, okay? So you're going to have to tell me about Benedicta O'Keeffe. Like, who'd play her? If we, I'm sure there's a movie deal in the offing or a Netflix series, but who are we talking about? Give me a visualization.
Well, coincidentally, she's small and dark, but that's as much as I can give you. I don't know who would play her. And every time I'm actually asked more often who would play Malloy, who is the kind of male lead. Women tend to ask me at literary festivals, who do I see as playing Malloy? And I always say that I don't hugely physically describe my characters. Even though I like to know what they look like myself, I tend to kind of cut pictures out of magazines and put them on the walls when I'm writing a particular character. I know in my head what they all look like, but I want my readers to imagine themselves and see the characters themselves. I think sometimes it sort of spoils things if you tell readers what the characters look like.
That's fair enough. But will you tell us a standard plot? I mean, obviously your background, it's based in the Inishowen Peninsula, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. I start with place because landscape and setting is very important to me, and very important to these books. These books couldn't be set anywhere else. My new contract, the book that I'm working on at the moment, is a standalone and it's a completely new setting. But for all of these books, they're all set either in imagined or real locations in the Inishowen Peninsula, but always in the Inishowen Peninsula. So I start with a setting, I start with a particular location on the Inishowen Peninsula. And it doesn't necessarily have to be where I have dumped the body. It can be just a location that's significant to the plot. And then I go from there. But you will find that my books are reliable to the extent that you can be guaranteed that you will have a body at the beginning, you will have an amateur sleuth, a limited cast of suspects, and a solution at the end.
Wow.
I will guarantee you that. So they're sort of, I don't want to say they're formulaic, but they're very much inspired by the kind of golden age of mystery.
It sounds very Agatha Christie-esque.
Yes, absolutely. Although and while I'm a huge fan of Agatha Christie, character is also very important to me. And place. So I would look at P.D. James for my inspiration, very much so.
And
even though I'm a massive Agatha Christie
as
fan.
well as the elements you've talked about, you also have a backstory. There's a sort of ongoing story of the Benedictus family and what happened in their past and ongoing issues.
So while there's a separate mystery in each book, and you can read each book separately, you're sort of rewarded if you read them in order because there's an ongoing story involving the protagonist and her backstory.
One of the things I liked about this one was I think would particularly appeal to any probate lawyers, because it's very rare that I get to read any novel that mentions Section 117 of the Succession Act.
That's a car chase for Mark. A reference to probate there. Oh my God.
You get it in the legal rights share, you get it in Section 117, you get it in revocation. It's all there.
Oh God, Mark, it must be too much for you, was it?
I mean, do remember, I practiced in Donegal as a small town solicitor, so that was an area I practiced in. I practiced in probate.
But one of the things, in fact, this particular one, which I've just read, brings out is the sheer breadth of law that you need to be on top of if you're a sole practitioner, because you're talking about going into the district court and representing people who are speeding. You're going to effectively take a deathbed will. There's all of these kind of issues, which, it must be very difficult to keep on top of all these things. And
I try and reflect that in the book, actually, the breadth of knowledge that she's required to have as a sort of a GP, But I do remember I can't remember if I've put this in the book, probably haven't disclosed it, but I certainly remember when I moved to Inishowen, first of all, obviously my experience was in the Midlands before I moved there. And when I set up my practice, I remember having a coffee with a colleague, a friend of mine, whose practice was Donegal and Derry. And he said, how's it going? Are the clients coming in the door? And I said, yeah, not too bad. Although I was asked yesterday, would I act for somebody in buying a boat? And I said, I hadn't a clue how to do it. And he said, what did you say? I presume you said you'd do it. And I said, no, I said I hadn't done it before, so I wouldn't. And he said, are you crazy? It pays really well. The next time somebody comes in, asks you to buy a boat, just ring me. Say you'll do it and then ring me. So it happened. About a week later, somebody came in and asked me to act for them in buying a boat. So I rang this friend of mine up and went, right, help, I've just said yes. And he said, okay, have you got a pen and paper? Right, number 1, there are 64 shares in a boat. Number 2, and he just taught me through it. And I did it a lot then after that. That was my first kind of couple of months. So it does show what a learning curve it is if you set up a practice on your own.
You have to give it a lash. You have to jump in sometimes. You mightn't have all the answers, but you'll figure them out. And you've got good colleagues who can help you.
Yes, but you have good colleagues at the bar, where you're running into people in the hallway and you're running into people, you can go and see somebody at their desk. If you're running a practice on your own, you very much need to cultivate friendships with other solicitors that you can kind of
I can imagine.
share.
Funnily enough, one of the points that our last guest, Barry Creed, was making was that, first of all, the split profession is very useful because you can draw on that expertise.
Yes.
But the other thing, and it comes across in your book, is the difficulty of recruiting good administrative staff, that, you need the support. I mean, you couldn't run the kind of firm you're describing there without somebody who's on top of all the paperwork, who's on top of all the finances.
And also the kind of blow-in element of it came into play there because being somebody who hadn't grown up in Inishowen didn't know some of the local sensitivities. And so my employees were local, and particularly my legal assistant. She's local, and she was fantastic, and I really needed her in terms of giving me advice.
You mentioned there earlier that you have international publication. You have an agent in America, and obviously in Britain, and you're going to all these festivals. How do your American readers, for example, how do they respond to Inishowen?
They respond well. I mean, when my first book came out, I spent a week my publishers are based in Florida for these books. And I spent a week in Florida. There was a big crime fiction festival called BL.On in a town called St. Petersburg in Florida. And I did some events and bookshops. And then I did this big crime fiction conference, they called it. And so I was on a number of different panels. And I think every Irish American fan spotted the Irish writer on the schedule and came. And so I had lots of conversations about people's ancestors. And so, and some people knew Inishowen and some people didn't, and they didn't care just because it was Irish. They wanted to read books set in Ireland. But obviously there's quite a bit of editing involved. The books change in terms of language and in terms of...
and do you do that editing?
My editors in the States do it and then consult me.
Okay.
They send me their edits and I get to say yes or no.
And I think some of your books have been translated to other languages. So.
One has been translated into German. So I have a German publisher for the first book.
And does that involve much consultation with the translator, or do you just let
there
them
wasn't
at it?
any. Yeah, there wasn't any in that case. Actually, there's far more consultation with the Americans than with the German.
And have you loads of inspiration for future stories? I mean, the Inishowen Peninsula, it'll never disappoint. There'll always be a twist and a turn that you can knock a plot out of.
I mean,
is that the way it is?
I sort of don't want it to turn into Midsummer Murders, and I am beginning to kind of ship people in to kill them. So if
maybe Benedicta could get on a bus to Portlaoise or to Ballyfin even.
She goes to Dublin in this one, actually.
Oh, wow.
So you will have to read
big
it.
city.
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
In fact, I think she travels to Norway in one as well, in book 2.
Am I going to recognise anybody when I read the book?
God, no. I used to be a lawyer. I'm very careful about that.
Well, am I going to say, oh, I spot that? Oh, yeah.
Not a bit of it.
No.
Well,
okay.
I mean, all characters...
All fiction.
All my characters are an amalgamation of characteristics, both physical and personality of people I know. You cherry pick from people that you know. If you see an interesting sort of personality tick, you use it.
Yeah, no, great. And I mean, the future, is it something that would translate onto the small screen or onto the big screen, do you think? Well,
they're optioned. The books are under option, or have been under option. And so we'll see. They were optioned, the first 3 books were optioned back in 2017. And, COVID obviously put all of those plans, they were about to be made, or so I was told, and that COVID put all of those plans into a bit of a coma. But
okay, so it could happen.
There's a revival happening.
And just to ask you, is it set in contemporary Ireland?
It is very much set in
Ireland of now.
Yes, although people have said to me that the early books don't appear to be that contemporary. And I think it's probably because I started writing them sort of 10 years before they were published. So there's a feel, there's a lack of mobile phone content and internet content in the early ones. But yes, they're supposed to be contemporary.
Okay, and can I ask you, final question, if you're, crime writers, as you say, there's quite a population of you in Ireland. I'm thinking of someone like John Connolly, who I knew in a previous life many, many moons ago, who's gone on to massive international success.
Yeah.
And there are others. And you mention P.D. James, for example, as somebody that inspires you. Anybody else you want to throw out there? Who's writing in the Irish context now? I suppose these are all your friends. You can't really say anything yet.
Yeah.
So maybe
if
that's an unfair
I choose 2,
question.
I'll have missed out 5, so I can't really do that.
Is it always going to be crime, Andy? Is it? Could you could you write something else?
Well, the book that I've started writing at the moment, or the book that I am writing at the moment, is, I wasn't sure what it was going to be, but it does seem to be taking that similar turn.
You inadvertently killed somebody and now it's a murder novel.
Absolutely. I was talking to somebody at the weekend and she was saying that she started writing a romance novel, and her agent wasn't at all happy about the fact that she was writing a romance novel. And then she got 800, she was on page 8 and she'd killed off the heroine. So she realised that she wasn't really cut out for romance.
And how long does it take you to write a novel?
Well, as I say, the first one took me 10 years, and then it's won a year since then because I have a contract and I have a deadline. So it's amazing what you'll do.
They're not always met, are they?
No, I do. I always meet my deadlines. Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I took from the legal profession into writing as a career. You know, deadlines are scare lawyers generally, and they generally don't scare writers, but they do scare me. So, and it's because I'm used to working to a deadline. They do. Well, I think they do anyway.
So, Andy, can we ask you about a book? Maybe we can. Do you want to? You know our thing about a book, and you know about a movie. Do you have a book maybe beyond maybe your field or whatever, something that might appeal to you that you'd like to recommend?
I guess I read 2 books this summer, both with a legal theme, and both of which I really liked. And one was Mark O'Connell's A Thread of Violence, which is about Malcolm MacArthur. I don't know if either of you have read that.
Yes, I've heard of that. Yeah.
It was written after a series of conversations.
He did a series of interviews,
yes.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
He spent quite a lot of time with him, and he spent time with him in his flat, and he spoke to him on the phone, and so there was ongoing contact over a long period of time. And I don't know what I was expecting, but I expected it to be, I think, more exploitative, and I wasn't sure whether I would like it or not. And I really liked it. I thought it was very sensitively written, and there's integrity there, and it's
integrity
unnerving.
In relation to MacArthur, or
in the way that he approaches the whole project.
Yes.
And he's very honest about. Mark O'Connell is very honest about his own doubts about doing it at all, and his concerns, and but I think what he produces is something that's very sensitively written. There's value written in it, definitely, and it's quite graceful the way he writes it.
Okay, very interesting choice.
Yeah.
And what about a movie?
Well, I was going to go for a second book, if that's all right.
Please do.
Movie-wise, I don't think I could come up with anything very original. I'd go down to 12 Angry Men or The Pelican Brief or something. So I'm going to go for Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I don't know if either of you have read that, but I would definitely recommend it. It came out in 1994. It's by John Berendt. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly, but it's set in Savannah, Georgia, and it's about the trial of an antique dealer for the murder of a male prostitute, and he was tried 4 times. There were 4 trials. But this book is as much about the atmosphere of the town and the characters. The back cover says it's a crazy quilt of oddballs, posers, snobs, sorceresses and outlaws. And that's exactly what it is.
Sounds like where I drink, but anyway.
It's brilliant. Right. It's really funny.
Fantastic, Andy.
Okay, so after all that, thank you very much, Andrea Carter, for coming in. And anybody who is interested can buy her latest novel, Death Rights, which is published by Constable and available in probably all bookshops, in fact.
Should be, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
That's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can we say a huge thank you to our guest, Andrea Carter, for coming in and talking to us about the world of crime writing. Gave up the bar, gave up being a solicitor, and has had a wonderfully successful career as a crime writer. I haven't read the books yet, Mark, but I'm going to. She's an old mate of yours. And I do recommend the novels. I loved Death Rights is the most recent one. Really? Okay, so you've heard all about them, folks. It's brilliant. They sound brilliant. I can't wait to pick one up and start reading one. So before we go, I would like to say a huge thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moran, for all his assistance in putting this together. And also to the great Lee Brennan, who has covered sound and recorded this podcast and puts us all at our ease. Lee, fair play to you, top man. And so that's it, folks. So from me, Peter Leonard. Myself, Mark Tottenham. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.